Among the 8 major Hawaiian islands in the Pacific Ocean lies Kaho'olawe. In 1941, the U.S. Navy began using Kaho'olawe for target practice. Just 35 years later, a group of Hawaiians believed it was their responsibility to protest the U.S. Navy's actions on Kaho'olawe, arguing that the bombing interfered with their cultural right to exercise religion, historical site preservation, and the island's environmental protection. Kohemalamalama o Kanaloa is another name for Kaho'olawe, translating to the southern beacon of Kanaloa, the Hawaiian god of the ocean, voyaging, and healing. Similar to its ancient name, Kaho'olawe was initially used as a navigational center for voyaging by Hawaiians. In the late 1700s, the Hawaiian monarchy established Kaho'olawe as a ranching land and later a penal colony. In 1893, the illegal annexation of the Hawaiian kingdom took place. These conditions further diminished the island's spiritual reverence and cultural significance. So, when the U.S. entered World War II, the United States identified Kaho'olawe as a strategic training ground for target practice. The island continued to be used for militarism into the Cold War as the U.S. sought lands to practice detonation of new weapons. The most renowned explosion was Sailor Hat that detonated at Puhianenui, the southwestern tip of Kaho'olawe in 1965. Operation Sailor Hat used 3 separate 500-ton TNT bombs in order to test the survivability of U.S. naval ships against simulated nuclear explosions. These detonations left irrevocable damage to Kaho'olawe. The bombs hit the island's water table, leaving the groundwater to be lost at sea with its inability to be replenished or recovered. As the war in Vietnam became less popular, civil rights and anti-war movements began to call into question increased militarism on the continent and the Pacific. In addition, these movements also influenced new protests by American Indians against colonization, which Native Hawaiians read about in the newspaper. The occupation of Alcatraz and Wounded Knee by members of the American Indian movement represented a strategy for restoring tribal sovereignty and treaty rights. As Native Hawaiians faced increasing land loss in their own right, the bombing of Kaho'olawe became a symbol of a new resistance. Between 1968 and 1976, several groups began to organize against the bombing of Kaho'olawe. Their intention was to bring to light the destruction of the island and publicize the challenges Native Hawaiians faced. In 1976, an organization formed calling themselves the Protect Kaho'olawe Ohana, or PKO. They argued that the military occupation not only desecrated a sacred land, but also violated the rights of Hawaiians' free exercise of religion. On January 4, 1976, 9 Hawaiians made the departure from Ma'alai Harbor on Maui to Kaho'olawe in order to peacefully protest the American military's actions. They were the first non-military personnel to inhabit the island since its naval occupation in 1941 and would later be called the Kaho'olawe 9. Among the 9 was Uncle Walter Riddy. His wife, Auntie Loretta, was present on the second occupation of Kaho'olawe.
And, the things that we knew about Kaho'olawe was a barren island. Just nothing on it, So we're seeing this island from a distance, and as we're getting closer, she gets larger and larger and larger. And we're saying, she's not a small island. She's big.
Because they had ALs, culture sites, housing sites. And we saw some with white circles. So some of the sites were actually targets that they were using as targets for bombs. And when I saw and heard that our ancestors didn't have a written language, so the only way I'm going to know about what happened was to look at the sites that they left behind. And they were bombing these sites. So in my mind, they were destroying our library. They were destroying the answers to our questions as Hawaiians. So I got pissed off. So from that moment on, I kind of lost it. And all I could think about was, we have to stop the bombing.
After the initial occupation of the island, Emmett Aluli, another PKO member, used the legal strategy and filed a class action suit against the United States Defense Department, suing the Naval Authority for violating 13 federal and state laws. This lawsuit was initially rejected. Thus, PKO resorted to occupying the island again.
So you had people coming from all kinds of different places. One to protect the United States values, and the other one for the Hawaiian values. And us young guys was caught in the middle.
In 1977, Walter Ritty and Richard Sawyer went to Kaho'olawe for religious purposes in opposition to the government's ruling. They were caught on the island and sentenced to 6 months in prison for trespassing.
They sent us to Halawa jail. Halawa is where all the murderers, rapists.
Their arrests symbolize how the United States dehumanized and devalued Hawaiians' rights to cultural and religious freedom. Unfortunately, during this occupation, 2 others disappeared and lost their lives in their attempt to visit Kaho'olawe.
I can recall the way your voice would fill the room.
While some Hawaiians were skeptical of the movement, the disappearance of Mitchell and Helm rallied the public to aid in the fight for Kaho'olawe. After the arrests and loss, PKO continued to use the courts to protest the occupation. The attorneys hired by PKO took a different approach, indicating that the U.S. military occupation and bombing violated the National Environmental Policy Act of 1970 and the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966, pleading for the Navy to complete archaeological surveys that documented historical and cultural sites. With both political allies and the public, PKO acquired over 10,000 signatures on a petition to urge President Carter to rescind President Eisenhower's executive order to prolong the Navy's military occupation and bombing. This petition helped to influence the 1977 Federal District Court's partial summary judgment that prompted the United States Navy to document and protect historical sites on island and mandated an environmental impact statement be done annually till the bombing of Kaho'olawe concluded. In 1980, a consent decree was implemented between the Navy and PKO that allowed Native Hawaiian cultural practitioners to access Kaho'olawe 10 times a year and authorized the U.S. to aid in revegetation. Despite all these efforts, the island was still under the control of the Navy in 1981. PKO continued to push for their right to protect the island from the military for cultural, environmental, and spiritual purposes. For instance, PKO contended that Kaho'olawe is a vahipana, a sacred place revered by Hawaiians, and according to the Hawaii Historic Places Review Board, is entitled to be considered as a National Historic Site. And with help from the state legislature, it became official. Then, finally, on October 22, 1990, President George Bush declared the discontinuation of Kaho'olawe as a weapons range. President Bush also mandated that a commission be formed to discuss the future return of Kaho'olawe to the state of Hawaii. In 1993, Daniel K. Inouye introduced an act which authorized the transfer of Kaho'olawe to the state of Hawaii, mandated the removal of unexploded ordnances, and called for the island's environmental restoration. Congress voted to permanently cease military operations and allocated $400 million for the cleanup effort. The following year, in 1994, the transfer of Kaho'olawe under the trust of the state of Hawaii took place on the shore of Maui. After 49 years, the island could finally rest against its relentless destruction by the U.S. Navy. Now, Kaho'olawe continues to stand as a living symbol of Hawaiian identity, resistance, and cultural pride. Due to its tragic history, Kaho'olawe continues to be restored, which inspires upcoming generations to understand the rights and responsibilities we carry as Hawaiians.
This is the beginning. After this, bow, we're going down to something else. What we're looking for is the truth. The truth, the truth, the truth, the truth. Aloha no.
The original Kaho'olawe 9, who took responsibility to ensure the rights of Kaho'olawe, continued their journey as activists. Emmett Aluli continued as a doctor and was a strong advocate for Native Hawaiian health. Uncle Walter and Auntie Loretta remained pillars of social justice and activists for environmental health. And Kimo Mitchell and George Helm remind us that Aloha Aina is not just a movement, but a lifelong responsibility.
Ohana.